My name is James Leland. I'm 42 years old. For most of my adult life, I stayed in the shadows of my own family, the quiet one, the dependable one, the one who always showed up early and left late, without ever asking for applause. I spent over 2 decades helping build our family's real estate business from the ground up. My brothers brought the flash, my cousins brought the connections, and I brought the grit. I handled the paperwork, the compliance, the audits. Not glamorous, but essential. Still, somehow, I was always just James who works for us. Never James, partner, or James, founder. I had no reason to question my place. We shared holiday tables, raised our kids together, and signed off on deals like clockwork. The money wasn't spectacular, but the loyalty felt worth more. I trusted them blindly. My older brother Marcus, the self-proclaimed visionary, my cousin Dean, always shaking hands and calling shots. I let them handle the front end, while I managed the gears behind the curtain. I figured we all had our roles, until that one night changed everything. It was a family meeting at my uncle's estate. One of those dinners where decisions were made over dessert. Marcus stood up with that rehearsed grin of his. Holding a manila folder. "James," he said, "we've been reviewing the structure. We think it's time you take a step back, focus on retirement." I remember the room going so quiet. Even the fireplace seemed to hold its breath. I waited for the joke. None came. I looked around and saw only nodding heads, complicit silence. My hands stayed folded in my lap. I didn't argue, didn't demand answers. I simply asked one question. "What about the shares?" Marcus tilted his head, fake sympathetic. "You were always on salary, James. You never signed the founder's agreement. There are no shares in your name." And just like that, 25 years of my life were wiped off the books with a smile and a slice of pie. They had rewritten history behind my back, a legal maneuver I hadn't seen coming, but I didn't flinch. I stood up, nodded once, and walked out. No fireworks, no raised voice, just the sound of my shoes echoing down the hallway and the faint clink of forks behind me. That was the night I stopped being family. But it was also the night I remembered something they didn't. I had the passwords, the files, the forgotten foundations. I had built the engine, and while they basked in the spotlight, I had quietly made a copy of the keys. Before I left the estate, I sat in my car and made one phone call. "Erica," I said to my assistant, "do me a favor. Start preparing the incorporation papers. Use the backup documents in the black folder labeled Leland." She paused, then whispered back, "Of course, CEO or managing director." I stared out into the cold, dark driveway, the old estate glowing behind me like a haunted memory. "CEO," I said. "It's time they learn what happens when the quiet one starts speaking in signatures." For weeks after that meeting, I found myself replaying every small moment I had overlooked. Every time Marcus brushed off my suggestions, every time Dean smirked when I handed over another signed contract. It was all there, like breadcrumbs I'd ignored while I stayed focused on keeping things running. I wasn't blind, just loyal, the kind of loyalty that assumes family will always do right by you, even when they stop seeing your value. I remembered birthdays I never missed, business trips I covered for them, even hospital bills I quietly paid when the company cash flow dipped. They never asked me for these things, they just expected them. And I never asked for thanks. I thought I was doing what any brother or cousin would do, but looking back I see it for what it was. Convenience disguised as kinship. They didn't value me. They depended on my silence. And I gave them silence, didn't I? Even when they slowly started shifting my responsibilities to outsiders. Even when they locked me out of key meetings. It wasn't a clean betrayal. It was slow, strategic erosion. Death by 1,000 omissions. The kind of treachery that doesn't scream, it whispers. And I had grown so used to trusting them that I mistook that whisper for wind. But now I heard it clearly, like a storm warning too late to stop the flood. What hurt most wasn't the money, it was the erasure. To be cut off was one thing, but to be written out of my own story, that was a theft I couldn't overlook. They had spent years pretending the business was built on charisma and charm, but without the paper trails, the contracts, the legal protections I drafted, their entire empire was standing on sand. I didn't need revenge. I needed recognition, and I knew exactly how to get it. There was something strange that began to grow inside me, not anger, but resolve. A steel-cold clarity that I had never felt before. For once, I didn't want to save anyone. I didn't want to forgive, or explain, or even be heard. I wanted to build something, not to destroy them, but to remind myself what I was capable of when I wasn't hidden behind someone else's curtain. I didn't need their invitation to power. I could build my own table. So, I disappeared, quietly. No contact, no arguments. While they toasted their victory, I spent my evenings in silence, planning a future with no place for them in it, and in that quiet, something incredible began to stir. I remembered who I was before they made me forget. Not just the fixer, not just the executor, but the visionary behind the bones of the company. The man who made order from chaos. They thought they'd buried me, but all they did was remove the lid. I started with the old documents, not the ones they still held in their glossy locked cabinets, but the ones I had stored in encrypted drives and dusty folders, long before anyone thought to trademark our family's name. Every contract, every zoning map, every lease I drafted was dated, signed, and traceable, and more importantly, most of the key assets were originally secured under my name for liability purposes. They'd forgotten that. I hadn't. There was one file in particular, a land acquisition contract from 2003, a massive plot we flipped for 8 figures. Legally, the transaction passed through a shell company under my control. We never dissolved it, never restructured the ownership. That company still existed, and it still owned several crucial lots that they assumed were absorbed into the firm. They hadn't noticed the fine print, but I had, and that was just the beginning. I hired a discreet legal team, young, hungry attorneys with no local ties and no questions. We redrafted every protection clause, moved ownership of key entities under a new parent company, and built something lean, airtight, and untraceable to the family name. I wasn't stealing anything. I was reclaiming what they thought no one was watching. While they leaned into flash and expansion, I invested in leverage. In silence, I became a fortress. My assistant Erica, loyal, brilliant, and sharp as glass, began contacting old clients, vendors, and partners we'd worked with for years. She didn't mention the family. She mentioned me, and slowly the phone calls started coming back. "James, I thought you retired. We've been meaning to reach out. Your name's still on our agreement." I wasn't back yet, but the city was already remembering who I was. And the family? They still had no idea. The more I uncovered, the clearer the truth became. They had never seen me as a threat, because I never demanded to be seen. That was my mistake. I let humility become invisibility, but now I was playing a different game. One where power didn't come from being loud, but from knowing where the foundation cracks, and I knew every weak point they'd covered in polish. Their confidence was built on a castle of assumptions. By the time the first quarterly reports from their new expansion came in, I already knew they were over-leveraged. Too much debt, too many blind spots, and I was holding the one asset they desperately needed to close their next deal, the zoning rights on a plot they thought they still controlled. Erica looked at me over coffee one morning and said, "They're going to call you." I nodded. "Let them. This time I'll be answering as CEO. The call came on a Monday morning. Not from Marcus, of course. He'd never lower himself to dial my number directly. It was Dean, with that familiar syrupy tone he used when he wanted something. "Hey James, listen, there's been a small hiccup with the city on that Harborview project. Apparently the zoning rights are still under an old holding name." I let the silence linger just long enough for discomfort to set in. "That's correct," I said calmly. "Leland & Co. still owns that parcel, always has." His voice tightened. "Right, so we were hoping we could work something out." Quietly. The same way they had erased me, the same way they had dismissed me. Now they wanted discretion. I told him I'd consider it and hung up. Then I waited. Over the next week I watched from a distance as the project stalled. Investors grew nervous, deadlines slipped. Every day that passed without a signature from my desk cost them credibility. And the irony? They couldn't admit publicly why. To do so would be to reveal that the man they ousted still held their keys. Marcus finally reached out, not with an apology but with a proposal. "We'll offer you a one-time settlement for the rights, clean, generous, and beneficial for all of us." He didn't say the number aloud, just sent it in a formal email. 7 figures, more than I'd ever been paid in my entire time with the company. I didn't respond. I forwarded the email to Erica and said, "Print it, frame it." That offer was never about fairness. It was panic wrapped in pretense. What they didn't understand, what they still couldn't grasp, was that I didn't want their money. I wanted the power to never be erased again. I wanted to own something they couldn't take credit for, and that's exactly what I was building. By now my new firm had quietly acquired 4 properties adjacent to their key projects. We weren't competing, we were surrounding. It was check, and they still didn't know they were one move from mate. They tried other routes, city council lobbying, backdoor deals, but every path hit a dead end because I'd already walked them first. My name didn't show up in any obvious ways, but the people who mattered knew who was really pulling the strings. One afternoon, Erica slid a newspaper across my desk. Front page, "Family Real Estate Empire hits unexpected snag in Harborview deal." I smiled. Quietly, strategically, and for the first time in years, I felt seen. The shift was happening. Not loudly, not with headlines or revenge speeches, just with pressure. Silent, surgical pressure. The kind of pressure that collapses facades without ever lifting a finger. They thought they'd pushed me into the shadows. What they didn't know was that I had learned to build in the dark, and now the light was mine to control. Their empire began to fracture in whispers. First, a financier pulled out of their Midtown Tower project, citing concerns about internal governance. Then a key construction partner delayed groundbreaking, citing paperwork issues, the very same paperwork I had quietly redirected months before. I didn't need to sabotage anything. All I had to do was stop protecting them. I had been their silent insurance policy for 2 decades. Once that policy expired, so did their stability. What surprised me wasn't how quickly it unraveled, but how badly they handled it. Marcus, once the picture of composed leadership, began making sloppy mistakes. Dean tried charm where caution was needed, and investors saw through him. They were panicking in public, a luxury I never allowed myself. While they scrambled, I hosted quiet lunches with former clients. No promises, just conversations, and each one ended the same way. "James, whenever you're ready, we'd follow you." One by one, the pillars they thought were theirs began to shift. A former architect signed with me. A logistic partner renegotiated to favor my firm's timelines. Even their head of legal, a man I'd mentored in his first year, left them citing philosophical misalignment, and joined my advisory board. I didn't gloat, I didn't brag, I just kept building. Every choice I made was quiet, deliberate, and untraceably poetic. Then came the final moment. Not an explosion, but an invitation. They reached out, not to negotiate, but to request a meeting, in person. A family gathering, just like the one that started it all. Only this time, the location was different. They came to my building, sat in my boardroom, drank water from glasses embossed with my company's initials. Marcus tried to speak first, but I stopped him gently. "Let's not waste each other's time," I said. "What do you need?" There was no satisfaction in watching them squirm. The real justice had already happened. They were forced to acknowledge me, not as a favor, not as a brother, but as the man who now controlled the future they thought they'd sealed off. I listened. I offered a short-term license agreement, strict, expensive, and with no ownership benefits. Marcus hesitated, but Dean signed it immediately. Desperation makes fast decisions. I left the room before they even finished the paperwork. Walking down the corridor of my own building, I paused by the window and looked out over the city. The same city they said I was too old school to lead in. But it wasn't about the city. It was about reclaiming the parts of myself I'd handed away in blind trust. The victory wasn't in the collapse, it was in the clarity. I never needed their validation, only the space to become who I had always been without them in the way. In the weeks that followed, I found myself waking up earlier than usual, not out of stress, but out of peace. The kind of peace that comes when your soul no longer flinches at the sound of old names or replays old betrayals. My phone didn't buzz with drama. My inbox wasn't clogged with requests for favors disguised as pleasantries. Instead, I started my mornings slowly, reading contracts I wanted to read, meeting with people who saw me for what I actually brought to the table. One afternoon, I passed the old family office building. It looked smaller now, not physically, but spiritually. The sign with our shared last name had once made me feel proud. Now it felt like a tombstone for a version of me I no longer mourned. I stood across the street, watching a new assistant rush inside with a half-empty coffee. It reminded me of all those years I walked in with loyalty in my chest, and not a single safety net. I felt no rage, just a quiet goodbye. I didn't attend the next family event, not out of bitterness, but out of choice. Some bridges don't need to be burned, they simply no longer lead anywhere you need to go. I sent a polite message, thanked them for the invitation, and returned to a dinner with my team. Real family, as it turns out, isn't always the one you're born into. Sometimes it's the people who see your worth, long before the world tries to erase it. My new company didn't just grow, it flourished. But more importantly, I did. I stopped waiting to be invited into rooms I helped build. I started building my own, and filling them with people who valued integrity over flash, wisdom over noise. Clients respected the calm way we operated. Partners appreciated our precision. And for the first time in years, I wasn't surviving a legacy. I was creating one. People often ask me if I ever confronted Marcus or Dean, if I ever demanded they apologize. The truth, I never needed them to. Their collapse spoke louder than any apology could. Their desperation was the loudest form of acknowledgement. And my silence, that was my power. Revenge doesn't always roar. Sometimes it just walks away with everything they thought you'd never reclaim. So now, when I sign a new deal, when someone calls me sir, or when I walk through the halls of a company bearing my name, I don't feel victorious. I feel free. I don't need them to know what they lost. I only needed to remember who I am, and make sure the world never forgets it again.